We're running very late, so this session will be shortened to 3 presentations. Richard Mayer will be shifted to the next session. We're going to begin with Jose Ortega, who was working with Greenpeace in Spain. His educational background was in physical sciences at University of Madrid. He's going to speak today on the renewable revolution. I'm going to limit each of the presentations to 20 minutes, and there'll be some questions after that 20 minutes is up while we're changing the next presenter. So, Jose, if you'd like to... Oh, where is he? All right, we'll try again. Bob Lloyd did a PhD in physics in Australia. He's been working on renewable energy for many years. He's now director of the energy studies at University of Otago, Dunedin, New Zealand. He's going to speak on the growth delusion, why we don't want to believe in peak oil and climate change. So, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm going to talk on something which is a little bit different than you've heard so far. I'm going to talk on why we don't want to believe in peak oil and climate change. I've been attending ASPO conferences for a number of years, and I've been giving talks on peak oil. And what amazes me is how you can present quite credible scientific and geological facts to people, and they just don't believe them. Colin Campbell calls such people, including the economists, the flat earthers, the people who don't want to believe in peak oil. But it also applies to people who don't want to believe in climate change. Before I continue, the key here is that we're not addicted to oil, but we're addicted to growth. Growth is the problem which is predicating both the disbelief in peak oil and the disbelief in climate change. Hubbard realised in 1949 that we needed to move from fossil fuels to renewable resources if mankind was to keep its high energy intact, and the population and our consumption. It was perfectly evident then, more so when the limits of growth came out in the 1970s, and we've heard a bit about this already. I always show this paper because it was put out in Science. It's Hubbard's first paper. It was put out in 1949, a few days before I was born. And we see in the top shelf the Hubbard curve based on millennia, and you can see how insignificant the oil resources are. The important one is the next one, where Hubbard saw quite clearly that we had to move to renewable energy resources. And he gave several scenarios. One scenario where we had a smooth transition, that is one, and he realised that to move to renewable energy, we had to piggyback off of the fossil fuels. To put in the embodied energy and the renewable energy devices, we had to use fossil fuels. If we didn't do that in a timely manner, then the energy consumption for mankind must decrease, and we must go to scenario 2. And if we really stuffed up and really didn't do the transition at all, then our energy supply would have to revert to pre-industrial levels. That is scenario 3 down here. He also realised that we had to put in place energy efficiency measures and reduce our total consumption. And of course he gave similar sorts of scenarios to the Club of Rome report, where if we didn't do the transition, that is keep our energy supply and keep it up here, our population must necessarily decline. We've talked a lot about whether renewable energies can actually fill the gap. I've worked in renewable energies for 30 years, and I'm a very strong proponent of it. But I'm now coming to the conclusion that it's going to be very difficult to scale up renewable energies to the sorts of levels that can supply the world market. And the really important thing is that even if we do make it, if we do make the transition, there is no question in my mind that sustainable energy supplies will be able to give us a continuing economic growth. If you work out how much energy you need to make the renewable energy devices, it's going to take about 20 years to put that in place. And if we have a growth of about 3.5% per annum, which is what the world expects, then after that 20 years, of course, we'll be back to where we started from. So my question, and the reason I'm embarking on this paper, is to answer the question why we've let the world get to the situation whereby the inertia of the global energy system will make mitigation of these problems in time to avert a catastrophe difficult or impossible. My answers, I wrote a paper which was presented as a poster at the Pisa conference, The Tragedy of the Commons, suggesting that the main problem was corporate interests, and they'd taken over community interests, and we talked a bit about that in terms of the Commonwealth yesterday, and the paper as the Commons Revisited the Tragedy continues, and it's on, I think, the ASPO website and our university website. But what I want to talk about today is another reason, which is because peak oil and climate change are seen as a threat to economic growth. And economic growth is an axiom of our economic system, and it's defended with absolute religious zeal. And here this is me out on a limb here. I'm a physicist, a physical scientist, but I'm going to be talking about literature and psychology and things which are not normally taken by physicists. The reason I'm doing this is that I cannot see any solution to this problem within the physical sciences. I think it's much deeper than that. We all have talked about growth. Growth wins. Proponents of non-growth have been attacked by proponents of growth over the last 2 decades and essentially marginalised. The number of non-growth economists in the world you can count on one hand. Everyone probably knows Herman Daly and the other half a dozen. It's been very difficult to suggest anything other than growth as a solution to the world's problems, and this is typified by the Washington Consensus, the free market consensus, which says that everything has to be deregulated, and that's the way that the world will go. And we've even invented a word for never-ending growth called sustainable development. And if you say sustainable development often enough, you might even believe it. In the developed world, the idea of unending economic growth originated from corporate imperatives for profits that arose out of the Industrial Revolution. Talked a lot about this. The reason the world has been able to have this large amount of growth is, of course, because of cheap energy. And growth has been given legitimacy by the free market economists, and the one who stands out here is Milton Friedman, who in the 70s and since then has promulgated essentially the Washington Consensus. And if you want to read more about Milton Friedman's effect on the world, then you should read the Shock Doctrine, and a lot of what the last speaker talked about in terms of South America and American influence is all detailed in that book by Naomi Klein. We've had lots of people denigrating economists. The whole idea of economic growth is that there is an invisible hand and you give lots of money to the corporate sector, and that sector will produce lots of money and growth, which will trickle down, the trickle-down theory, and eventually get to you and me and the poor of the world, and that will keep them happy. So that's the theory. The practice, however, has not been quite so well, and the poor have fared quite poorly in terms of the trickle-down theory, and you've probably read newspaper articles about what's happening in just this year in terms of poverty and food supply. In very recent months, weeks, we haven't had a trickle-down theory, but we've had a deluge-up theory, whereby the money flow is not trickling down, but going up to the corporate sector. In the developing world, growth is seen as an ethical argument. I mentioned in a question yesterday that in Malawi, in the very poor countries, that they are likely not to be affected by peak oil. I didn't mean to say that because I thought that was a good thing for developing countries. I just suggested that a student of mine who was working in that area thought that that was the inevitable consequence. Because if we're going into peak oil and energy supplies are declining, unless the rich countries give up part of their energy supply, it's unlikely that the developing countries will be able to increase theirs. From an ethical point of view, of course, the developed countries have done it. They've used the energy, and so the developing countries think it's now their turn. And of course, if you're in poverty, any further increase in population, and the poor countries have got general very high population growths, means that if you don't expand your economy, you will most likely die. It seems obvious from a physical perspective that growth cannot continue forever in a bound system. There has been lots of books written on this. It seems as obvious as pie. Yet growth is not seen as a limiting factor by much of society today. We all want growth. Even in the current economic crisis, if you've been reading the newspapers, and my interpretation is that the crisis has been caused by growth, the economies of the world, the bankers and the governments are all urging more growth to retrieve the situation, not to fix it. But of course, economic growth implies an increase in resource consumption. And this is some work I did in New Zealand a couple of years ago. The bottom axis is income. It's looking at different income groups in New Zealand against energy use. And there's a very clear correlation. As you get richer, you use more energy. And if you look at the higher income brackets, the energy is in the form of air transport and consumer goods. So if you make people richer, they are going to use more consumption. So the corollary of that, of course, is that to become sustainable, you have to become poorer. And people don't like to think that. It's also the reason that economic growth doesn't necessarily imply an increase in well-being. And again, there's a very large literature, The Growth Illusion by Douthwaite, Affluenza, Growth Fetish by Clive Hamilton, other people who've suggested that an increase in growth doesn't in fact lead to a real increase in happiness past a certain point. So the question is, how has the belief in something so seemingly irrational and dangerous as unlimited growth in a finite world ever happened? Certainly, corporate marketing and corporate vested interests have to take some of the blame. But why have people accepted this nonsense? Why have we been all led like sheep by the corporate world to accepting something which is just physically impossible? Why have we all become seduced by wanting more economic growth, more possessions, higher status, etc.? Maybe an answer can be found on the human brain. I think I've got to the stage whereby I can't look for solutions anywhere else than other in our own mind. And to this extent, I've looked at evolution and how the mind has developed and tried to find out how this could have occurred. The human brain evolved in the Pleistocene and earlier. There's been very little evolution in the human brain over the last few thousand years, and certainly not very much in the last few weeks. It evolved when we were hunter-gatherers, and there's considerable evidence to suggest that the way the brain works is not conducive to coping with the sorts of problems we have in the modern world. Hunters and gatherers were very far away from the limits to growth, and so the sorts of intellectual capabilities which we evolved just can't work in today's age. There's considerable evidence to suggest that the brain acts in a modular manner, and one of the first persons to look at this was Paul MacLean, and he developed a theory called the triune brain theory, where the brain developed in 3 stages. The reptilian stage, that's the brown one on your, the green one on your screen. That's responsible for much of our instincts, our gut feelings. This is the sort of area of the brain which our last speaker on the markets talked about. This is the animal instincts. That's what runs our markets at the moment. Then there are the emotions, the mammalian brain. And finally, we have the Homo sapiens brain. This is the one which does the scientific theories and the thinking and hopefully the rational thinking, but they're quite separate. Some of you might remember Arthur Koestler. Arthur Koestler wrote in the 1970s. He developed theories of intelligence from the triune brain theory, and he suggested that the most striking indication of the pathology of our species is the contrast between its unique technological achievements and its equally unique incompetence in terms of social affairs. And if you look at mankind's developments in science compared to its developments in social science, in war and famine, etc., you'll see that that's pretty obvious. So why has that happened? My suggestion is because different parts of the brain are responsible for each of those tasks, and the areas of the brain might not talk to each other very well. They're ring-fenced from each other. Thomas Kuhn talked about in the structure of scientific revolutions in the 1960s that science develops in terms of paradigms. So the areas of the brain contain scientific theories and defend them against all others until a revolution comes along. Bill Catton wrote Overshoot. Some of you might have read that book. he visited us recently in Dunedin. He talked about bubbles in the brain, whereby we have ideas and we keep them locked in bubbles, as did Homer Dixon in The Upside of Down. So our thinking on certain subjects is ring-fenced. Triune brain theory is an old theory. It's been discredited now. It's quite obvious that organs such as the eyes and limbs, we don't have 3 eyes, a mammalian eye, a reptilian eye, etc. So the triune brain theory is a bit dodgy, but there is still an incredible amount of evidence from biologists, from neurologists, from brain scientists, from archaeologists, from anthropologists. You can see the number of authors there that suggest that the way the brain works is in a modular manner. It might not be specific in certain physical parts of the brain, although some parts are responsible for certain tasks. So whether you call them modules, bubbles, or paradigms, our brain is so construed to think of certain things in certain parts of the brain. Goodness. The other problem is that a modular brain structure also allows a good deal of cognitive dissonance. That is, you can think and believe one thing in one part of the brain and completely believe something completely different in another part of the brain. George Orwell, of course, calls that double think. So back to Hubbard. Hubbard in 1949 on the human condition talked of a cultural lag. In view of the rapidity with which the transition to our present state has occurred, it is not surprising that we should continue to react with the fundamentally simple physical and chemical and biological needs of our social complex with a sacred cow behaviour of the past. Interpreted, Homo sapiens has not had the time to be able to evolve to cope with the intensely scientific problems posed by global warming and resource depletion. In that case, Hubbard preempted the evolutionary psychologists by quite a few decades. The evidence for a growth module in the brain, in fact, parallels the evidence for a religious module in the brain, and this is where the title of the talk comes from, the God delusion, the growth delusion. In Dawkins' book, he gives several reasons why religion has been spectacularly successful. And the reasons include indoctrination at an early age, exclusivity, evolution leading to a genetic predisposition, and that's the main theme which he looks at in his book, and also mimetic disposition. I won't have time to talk to you about memes. Memes are a Richard Dawkins' invention, and you can read either his books or Susan Blackmore's books to look at that. And finally, powerful vested interests. So what I'm suggesting here is that it's quite possible that there is a genetic predisposition towards growth. There's certainly a predisposition towards population growth. If we don't reproduce, then the species will die out. But there's also evidence to suggest that there might be a predisposition towards economic growth. Selfish genes can be exhibited as selfish phenotypes. We all like to collect stuff to gain advantage over our survivals. We also like to show off to our prospective mates. If you have lots of cars and lots of things, then you might gain a better mate. And in terms of growth memes, things such as rich is successful and poor is a failure is something which is likely to be propagated. In population growth, most of the world's population for our early prehistory was extremely low, around about 0.1% per generation. This very low rate is hard to explain, as usually poor people reproduce more and rich people don't. Okay, there was no healthcare in the Pleistocene, but even so. One theory to account for the low population growth is that human societies periodically suffered population collapses. This theory fits in well with genetic evidence which suggests that modern Homo sapiens evolved from a fairly low genetic base. The evolutionary pressures during the collapse period must have been substantial, and according to some researchers, surviving collapse tended to favour individuals with inherited wealth and status. And there are a number of examples from contemporary history which I won't go into, but I might suggest that some of the bankers and corporate bosses are a result of this evolution. So if we combine a modular brain with a genetically inherited tendency towards accumulation of wealth, you might very well have a growth and status module in the brain. This idea has been taken on board by the marketing industry, and I won't have time, I'll have to skip this, but there's a whole literature on neuromarketing where the industry has taken on board marketing to the lower parts, the basic parts of the brain, including branding, where you own parts of the human brain. And children, to complete the triune brain theory, the neuromarketing business now is targeting children. And if you want to read some really scary stuff on the web, type in neuromarketing and children. So, getting towards the end, the success of the growth module is indoctrination at an early age, exclusivity, evolution leading to a genetic predisposition towards growth, mimetic predisposition, and powerful vested interests, the same that occurred in the growth in the God delusion. So it appears that our ability to solve complex problems such as climate change and peak oil might be compromised by the structure of our brain, not allowing to mitigate in a rational manner. And our recent belief in growth parallels our longer-term belief in religion. They may tap into the same areas of the brain. In addition, growth is needed by people in the third world just for survival. And there's an irony here. When growth stops, and it must stop eventually, perhaps sooner than later, then the final struggle for resources will advantage those of us who are predisposed towards a reptilian brain solution. That is, those with inherited wealth and a strong survival instinct. And that, of course, seems to be what's happening now in the financial world, and not necessarily those who saw it coming. In addition, it may even be that areas of the brain, such as the R complex, which have been selected for because of advantages in terms of short-term survival, might even be predisposing us towards collapse, because those are the times that those areas of the brain function best. So in summary, why we want growth and not to believe in peak oil or climate change: indoctrination, advertising, marketing and propaganda, exclusivity, corporate moves to ensure that free-market thinking's axiomatic, an evolutionary predisposition towards growth module in the brain, and a modular brain which allows a good deal of cognitive dissonance. So how do we extricate ourselves from this dilemma? My conclusion is that we need a new Copernican revolution, a new world view. Richard Douthwaite came to the same view. The Copernican revolution saw a division between the religious module and science. We need a division between the growth module and economics. And that's all. The full paper, sorry it's been a bit rushed, but you can read the full paper on our website and on the website, the ASPO website, when it comes out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. Now, I'm told Jose came into the room at some stages.
Your presentation was pretty close to what Nate Higgins presented last year at Cork. And one thing I can tell you, I'm not an expert in these subjects, is this. My father was born in a very small village in the mountains, and they lived a totally sustainable fashion. They were practicing what we call now today a subsistence agriculture. And what I can tell you is this: most of the things that you showed now in your presentation do not apply to that kind of community. And I think one of the things that we are missing now is that sense of community, that proximity with a larger group of people, where we don't think so much of ourselves, but much more on the other people around us. And I think that's one thing missing right now in our society. You know, my tribe here is the old one. You know, Paul is in Canada, Francois is in Switzerland, Rembrandt is in Netherlands, and Chris is in England. You know, my tribe is completely dispersed, and I have no physical connection to them. And so my way of thinking is completely concentrated in me, in my life, in my local things. So I get much more greedy about things, and I lost completely that sense of community, of caring for the common good, for the commons, that my father had when he was born. Thank you. Just a comment.
I agree entirely. No problem there. over the Christmas I'm going back to my wife's village in Fiji, and they live a very sustainable lifestyle there. The only problem with being sustainable and poor is that it tends to be boring. The population in my wife's village is depleting, and that all the young people, people who want to work, have moved out of the village for the reason that sustainability doesn't appeal to them. So while a lot of people here would like to become sustainable, they in fact want to go to the big lights. They want to go to the cities, and that causes some confusion in my household sometimes. A whistle, you mean a time-out, so we spend some time one place, some time another place.
Okay, I think we have to move on. We're running late enough, we better I think we'll have to stop at that point. Next speaker will be Jose Ortega. He did degrees in physical sciences at the University of Madrid. He works with
Just a quick question.
I have to be very quick because we're running very late.
One thing that you didn't mention is the way we design our monetary system. As many of us know, most of the money supply is created as bank credit when banks lend it at interest. So would you say that the way we've designed the monetary system is a consequence of these things that you describe, or are these things a consequence of how we chose to design our monetary system? So what is cause and effect, in your opinion?
Certainly the monetary system is a whole part of it. As I explained in the Commons Revisited paper, if you want to become sustainable, if you earn lots of money and put your money in the bank, of course that money not only earned interest, but if you put $1 in, the bank lends out $10, and that money is used for energy expenditure. So you can't be sustainable in any other way other than reducing your expenditure. And that, of course, is why it's so unappealing. You can't convince governments or politicians to suggest that people should earn less money. It just wouldn't go down. They would never be elected. And so, yes, you're right. The whole monetary system will necessarily have to be reformed to solve the growth problem.
Okay.